too important. So I can't place it, I will hate to see it be dropped in the ladder of priorities. That isn't an answer, but it's a call for public education to return to its state of value and primacy in our society.
Do you mind if I add to that as a professor of education in Carol's department, actually? I think a couple of things on the K through 12 level that are occurring. You can't hear this? Did you hear it in the back? Yeah, they can hear it. There are a couple of things in the K through 12 education system that might address what you asked, Joe. And that has to deal with, first off, we are educating many millions more students today than ever in the history of the United States. Almost 54 million students came to classrooms in September and late August. That's incredible. We have a 95% graduation rate over time in the United States. That costs money. And it costs money, as Barry will tell you, at the university. The more students you have, the more costs, right? And if you want a quality education for your child, whether it's K through 12 or at the university, particularly at the university, and you want them to be competitive in the marketplace after graduation, you have to have cutting-edge technology in your classrooms. That's a very expensive proposition. So I don't think it has to do with, I mean, we're not getting paid outrageous amounts of money, and God knows K through 12 educators are not at all. But it's the opportunity cost of getting a good quality education that really drives it up. That's the real reason, okay? If you look at 1953, the year I was born, we had 58% of the students eligible to be in high school. 58%. Today it's closer to 100%, and that costs money. So that partially answers it. Okay. The mic for questions is up here, so if you want to just walk up to the Manhasset stand. Actually, this one is not a Manhasset. That's why it doesn't work well. It's a Wenger. Come on up here, and you can ask the questions of the panels. We're ready for that, right, Joe?
Sure, yes.
Okay, anybody wants to come up, come on up.
Hi, my name is Jared, and I have a question for anybody that would like to answer it and any part of it. This might be a question that is putting the cart before the horse, but I'm young, that's what we do. So my question is, I read recently rather, an idea that I can sum up as environmentalism is humanism. And that's the idea that the longer we wait to affect change in how we interact with our environment, the more likely it is that our environment starts to affect change on our ability to exist in it. And once we agree on that, we kind of have to acknowledge that other animals, humans also being animals, play a role in the structure of the environment. And they play an essential role in that. And with that in mind, it seems to me then that what we are calling human rights needs to also then begin to be extended past this single animal. And so that's why I wonder, maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse because we still can't even, it seems, to decide on what is human rights and how they should be implemented. So, yeah, I'm not sure what exactly, where exactly to put the question mark in there, but if you would like to address that, or anybody.
Well, I'll offer a brief response to get started. There's a lot of discussion in indigenous studies about diverse cultural worldviews that do include what's often called other than human persons, right? So non-human entities of various kinds, some in the material world, quote unquote, some not, but just a very inclusive sort of vision of who's in your cosmos and who do you need to be interacting with in a respectful fashion. So incorporating more of those kinds of worldviews sort of helps to support and underwrite this idea of environmentalism as humanism. The other thing which others here may know much more about than I do is there have been some interesting developments in Bolivia, for example, in developing a constitution that deals with environmental as well as, they call it, some scholars are talking about a post-human rights kind of, approach. And so some of the discussions and debates surrounding that seem very centrally involved in what you're describing.
I would just like to address seeing what Erica was gonna talk on Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples do a phenomenal job of safeguarding the richness of the diversity or eco-diversity. And so from an economic perspective, if you looked at an indigenous person's land mass compared to the civilized world, the indigenous people's land mass is almost always, in fact, I can't think of one example where it's not, more valuable, because everything is still there, because they value everything that's around them besides just extracting as fast as you can to make a profit off it. Personally, I really enjoy studying indigenous cultures because I think they offer a lot of value besides just our typical make as much money as you can as quick as you can.
Question? Just lastly, we're talking about this framework, which is just another question of what will improve or detract from the quality of life of the people who you are thinking about taking some action with regard to water sources, land rights, where they should live, because a lot of times it's displacement. And that certainly should be part of the conversation. You just have to make sure that is part of the conversation. So to put that in and not interject, just make sure you have a seat at the table so they value that and you take that into the calculus, whatever the final decision is, because people have different values on ecology and wildlife and humans.
It seems in America that we have a value for human rights, but we don't put that value into practice. A good example is occurring right now with the convention, the UN Convention for the rights, human rights for persons with disabilities. It seems to be a conflict. Also, the Convention for Children has not been passed by our Senate. Why do we have such conflict here, do you think?
I'm going to avoid that question. And first, I spoke as if the law wasn't a really important part of this, but it is. You have to see where we were 20 years ago and 30 years ago, and the rights that people have exerted, and the protections for children and the rights of children and LGBT that wouldn't have existed without the laws. I think when I'm thinking about Burns and other people is where is this conversation taking place? And also, if the conventions had been adopted in this country, and I hope they are, what difference would it make and how would it percolate down to make a meaningful difference in our people in a community? So I think we've tried, and I know you're really involved in lobbying. And that's something the Human Rights Center might consider is asking the senators to say, why isn't this convention or treaty being passed? And to throw your weight and academics and clout behind it.
I was just going to comment on the sort of UN as a body, right, for developing and implementing conventions and so forth. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, took forever to get ratified by the General Assembly, and then there was some serious foot dragging by especially 4 big settler colonies, the US, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, who finally did in the next couple of years kind of sign on to it, but at the same time have continued to interact with indigenous peoples in very similar ways to before having signed it. So I share your frustration that a lot of times I believe the economic and political interests that underwrite the status quo are incredibly powerful, and that there are cultural then justifications that come on top of that. And the more that we can identify those and combat those cultural assumptions and to highlight that, hey, we need to rethink this instead of taking it for granted. As an anthropologist, that's one thing we commonly talk about with teaching students and so forth, is that we're all cultural beings. There's a huge amount of information, assumptions, values that we take for granted by virtue of being human. That's what culture does for us, right? And so to take it out and look at it is an effort and an energy expense and so forth, and a persuasive act. So it's figuring out those channels, right, for coming in and figuring out what are the cultural assumptions. If you can start identifying and talking about those, maybe you can then get into some more explicit commentary about the political and economic agendas that are being served by maintaining these practices rather than transforming them.
I would just add also that I think it's a state sovereignty issue as well. The US is notorious for not signing on to a lot of these treaties, and it comes down to, in some circumstances, wanting to protect our citizens from being beholden to these international laws, or to protect our government from being beholden to these international laws. And so it may not be maybe a very happy thought, but I think that does play into it as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for this session, so thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.